Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. SAMAC recently sent out a composting best practice, as many of you should know. And to further solidify our knowledge on this topic, our co-author on this best practice, Okker Botha, who works for Yara as a soil scientist, he did his postgrad thesis on composting, so we think he is the ideal candidate to tell us more about this topic today. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we will answer them at the end. Thank you so much. Okker, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, today we're just going to do let's say a brief overview and introduction to aerobic composting in macadamia orchards. And the idea is to give us some frame of reference as to why we do composting, how it works, what's the fundamentals of it, so that everybody can just understand the application thereof, and also just practically what it looks like on a farm and what are some of the options. Of course, there's a lot of detail that one can go into, and analysis and various ways of applying it. But today we're just going to be going over the basics of it, and then hopefully this will give us all something to work on and go started on our farms or understand the basics of it. We're not going into the deep science of all the different results, etc., but more of the basics of composting in general. All right, so then what is aerobic composting? That's probably our first question that we need to answer. And why are we speaking about aerobic composting? The basics of aerobic composting is that it's the biological decomposition and the stabilization of organic substrates. And the key here is it's under aerobic conditions. And what will happen then, naturally, it will create thermophilic temperatures, meaning higher temperatures due to the biological heat being produced. Now, what is different to aerobic composting versus the contrary, that is fermentation, is exactly that. Fermentation is done under anaerobic conditions, so no oxygen available. Aerobic composting is done in the presence of oxygen. So it's two different methods of breaking down organic material through biological means, meaning microbes, but it has two different results at the end of the day, and the purposes of it is slightly different. So we are focusing on the aerobic side and not the fermentation side or the anaerobic side. And what is the goal? So the goal is to create a stable organic product that's free of pathogens. We don't want any diseases in our orchards, that doesn't have any unwanted seeds and weeds in it. And then that has reduced the fermentability, so it's taken away the bad odors and the aspects that can ferment, and at the end of the day, which is a mature organic material. And mature is relative to a certain degree, the term, but if we speak about being mature, it means it has broken down to a place where it will react in it's a predictable way to a certain extent. It's not still volatile, meaning can do various things in the field when applying. We already know it's broken down to a certain degree. Okay, so then why do we apply compost? So and the reality is it's easy. It's to improve our soil health. Soil health is a broad term for various factors, but it encapsulates all of these. It encapsulates a good structure in your soil. A healthy soil is a soil that's not compacted, that's got some good structure, that's got some good aeration. A healthy soil is a soil that has a good water holding capacity. A healthy soil is a soil that can hold nutrients effectively and release it and make it available for the plants. A healthy soil is a soil that has a well-balanced chemistry, meaning the relationship between elements are there, but also all the elements are in sufficient amounts, ppms or grams per kilogram, so that it's plant available as needed. And then lastly, of course, it's biodiversity. So biodiversity can be in terms of carbon content in the soil, but also microbes and various other biologicals that are in the soil. And The reality is that organic matter is what builds our soil health. It's the foundation of biodiversity and the balance of these things. And when we compost, we are building our organic matter in the soil, which then improves all of these factors relating to soil health. So for practical reasons, I thought I'd share. This was some great slides I received from Neil Miles, and this is some good examples of soils. And if you had to pick whether you would prefer farming in the soil on the left versus the soil on the right, I think most of us will probably prefer the soil on the right. And if we look at the next slide, if you prefer on looking at the soil on the left or farming in the soil on the right, most of us will prefer the soil on the right. Of course, look at that. It's nice and dark and brown color. It's got a nice hue. It's got some beautiful roots. It looks nice and loose. If we look at the next one, it would be the same. We can see there if we prefer the one on the left or the right, of course, the one on the right would be the preferred soil. Now, the interesting thing about all of these pictures are, all of these are actually exactly the same soils taken next to one another in terms of just farm management practices being different. So these soils are within meters from one another, not necessarily in macadamias, but in this case, on the left-hand side, it's a piece of sugarcane that's been farmed with sugarcane for 50 years. And the other soil on the right-hand side is literally taken in the permanent grassway next to the sugarcane. So it's the same mineralogy, the same soil, but that's the difference that we see in the structure due to management practices. In this case, of course, grassways has more roots. It's got more natural biologicals and diversity in it. So we see the farm management practices at the end of the day influence our soil structure and our soil health. The same here. This is two fields right next to one another. Maize on the left and permanent pastures on the right. Now, as we all know, pastures has been shown to increase our soil health to a large extent because of the natural grasses, lots of roots, organic matter build up, the cattle that's replenishing it with manure and it builds up over time, etc. So this is exactly the same soil, meters from one another. I don't have the pictures in here, but there's actually a picture to show the two samples. It's like 10 meters from one another. And it's just to show what organic material and management practices can do to a soil structure. The same thing on this photo. On the left, it's sugarcane, 40 years with no cover. And on the other side, it's your sugarcane that was residue, the cover was left behind. So the key concept of composting is we are trying to improve our soil health. We are trying to improve all those aspects at the end of the day to give us resilience in our soil, to improve our sustainability in the long run. Now, this is a great slide also that Neil Miles showed. And if we go look at soil health as a picture with regards to gears, we can see that there's various factors that needs to be considered in soil health. And then we can see, so our physical soil structure plays a role in terms of soil health, meaning drainage, water holding capacity, aeration, and compaction. Our nutrients is a gear. At the end of the day, all the different various macro elements and micro elements that the crops and the biologicals and everything need to feed on. Those are, of course, the nutrients that they need as food. The chemical structure of soil determines the soil health, meaning is it acid, is it saline, is there some chemical imbalance that reduces the availability of certain elements or can kill certain microbes and biologicals. And then lastly is your biological component, earthworms, fungi, bacteria, and nematodes. All of those things are at the end of the day come together to build your soil health. So if one of these gears fall out or is out of balance, the other gears will stop turning also, or they can maybe continue for a little while, but something's going to break at the end of the day. So when we're speaking about soil health, this is what we're trying to address. We are trying to get our soil in balance, and we want to make sure all the gears are working. Now, the reality is compost can address all of this. So compost can improve your structure. It can improve your water holding capacity. It can help with natural drainage. It can reduce compaction. Compost, if it's done well, it can be rich in nutrients. So it can add some of your macro and micronutrients to the soil. So providing food for the biologicals and providing food for the tree, macadamia in this case. Compost can influence your soil pH and your salinity and acidity issues. At the end of the day, if you've got a good compost, it can hold on to some of those sodium cations that can be in the soil, and it can help buffer a lot of our salinity issues. But it can also treat our pH at the end of the day. So usually a compost, as it starts being composted, the pH goes up, and then usually it stabilizes around 7, 7.5, maybe 8. So it can address acidity in the soil by bringing up the pH slightly, but it can also just act as a neutral buffer. Because it stays neutral, you can manipulate it to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, it can influence your soil pH. And then lastly, of course, compost is the food for the biologicals. They need organic matter to feed on, to reproduce, and at the end of the day, to keep your diversity going. So compost is key in our soil health aspect. Great. Then there's about 5 key steps in composting, and this is just if you need to think I'm going to start composting tomorrow. This is just the 5 basic things that you need to think of and that you need to work through, and there are various ways to do each one of these steps. We're not going to look in detail at every single one, but the 5 basic steps is, first of all, you need to select where you're going to make a compost heap. Now, first of all, it's important that you want a well-drained, preferably flat and easy place to work. We don't want to be making our aerobic compost in a drainage ditch or somewhere where water will accumulate at the end of the day. We don't want to make our compost heap where all the nutrients can be drained out and maybe let's say end up in a waterway somewhere or in our dam where it can cause various other issues in terms of water quality. We want to have an easy place to work. At the end of the day, you need to think about mud, and will the tractors and the machinery be able to work around it? Is it accessible easily? So think of a nice open spot that's well drained, that's going to be easy to manage. You don't want to be struggling to make your compost or to be tracking in pathogens or anything like that. So site selection is point number 1. Point number 2 is you need feedstock. You need organic material to make your compost. Now, for us on farms, it's often what we have available, but the core principle here is you can compost anything, but the more diverse your material or your feedstocks is, the better your compost is for diversity, for biologicals, and for, let's say, effectiveness at the end of the day. You can just think about it. Someone that just eats one type of food every day for the rest of their life will be less healthy than someone that can have a well-balanced meal. So if we want more microbes, more biologicals, more earthworms, we want to give them various feedstocks to be able to feed on. So your compost is better if you've got more material, but it's not necessary to have various ones, but that's the idea. Think of what you have available. Some of us, we probably have some macadamia husks. We have some branches and some leaves. We might have something else that we're planting that there's some residues that we can use. There might be a chicken farm next door. There might be a cattle farm close by. We can start thinking about what materials we have available. Step number 3 is the making of the pile, and then the key principles of it is it needs to be turned to be an aerobic compost, i.e. oxygen brought into the mix. It needs to be watered, and then it needs to be measured in terms of temperature to make sure that the composting process is actually taking place. So turning is bringing oxygen in, watering is providing water for the microbes. They're also thirsty, they also need moisture. And then last thing is measuring temperature to know if our maturation process is taking place and if the compost is getting to a mature point. 4th part is resting. it's important to let your compost just rest a little bit to make sure that it's finally matured and that it's settled and that you're not putting something volatile on your crops. There's always risk to that. And the last thing is application. How, where, why. There you need to make some key decisions as to how much compost do you have and what would be effective in terms of using it at the end of the day. Now, speaking further about the step number 3 in terms of turning, watering, measuring the temperature, I quickly want to touch on the factors affecting decomposition. So, of course, the purpose of composting is taking raw organic material and turning it into a mature plant available and microbially diverse product. And for decomposition to take place, there are a few key aspects that we need to think of. Of course, we're taking it from being a branch into being something that is rich in nutrients, that has got a nice structure, that's easy to work with, that's safe for application. Now, all of these factors play a role in the decomposition process. So first of all, we start off by looking at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Why is this important? You've probably heard it, carbon to nitrogen ratio in terms of organic material and compost. Well, the basics of it is, if you just can remember, that microbes use carbon as their source of food to a certain extent. So carbon is the amount of, let's say, food that's available to the microbes. And nitrogen is part of the food, but it's part of DNA and reproduction and enzymes and proteins and all of those type of connections. So if we have a high carbon compost, we will often see a massive spike in temperature and microbial burst in terms of breakdown. But what will happen? We'll see a die-off in terms of decomposition because there's not enough nitrogen in relation. So what happened? The population of the microbes grew to maybe exponential, but then they couldn't reproduce anymore. Why? Because there wasn't enough nitrogen to produce the proteins and the RNA and the DNA of the microbes to have a long-lasting population. So the decomposition will slow down quicker if the carbon to nitrogen ratio is not correct, if that makes sense. So that's why the balance of food versus nitrogen, carbon versus nitrogen, is very important for the longevity of the decomposition process. Too little carbon won't give us any temperature. Too little nitrogen won't give us any longevity in terms of decomposition. So it might just take very long, and then it becomes a different set of microbes that starts breaking down the material, which takes a lot longer. Texture of organic material. This is pretty obvious. Of course, if you're going to put big chunks of raw wood or any raw material in a pile, it will take much longer to break down and to become a mature compost. So depending on what you want to use your compost for, you need to think about what texture you want to use. So do you need to chip it? Do you want to just use big branches? Do you have equipment to work with it? Because that will determine your timing and also the rate of decomposition. Anything that's big will take much longer to decompose at the end of the day. All right, aeration, oxygen. Microbes require, let's say, aerobic microbes for aerobic require oxygen at the end of the day for respiration. So we need to get oxygen inside our pile to continue the decomposition process. Let's say we have, for example, 100 microbes in our pile, which is a vast understatement, but 100 microbes in your pile. As soon as oxygen is running low in that pile, maybe 70% of those microbes become inactive. And now there's only 30% of them that actually can continue the decomposition process. So the time the pile will take to break down just becomes a lot longer. Moisture levels, the same thing. We need moisture, they need water. So if it dries out, we will not have any decomposition. Just for interest's sake, in terms of moisture levels, the ideal moisture level for breakdown is roughly between 50 and 60% moisture. So that's kind of like a sponge. If you almost put a sponge at like field capacity to a certain extent. There needs to be oxygen, but there also needs to be adequate moisture in the pile for the decomposition program to continue. And last thing, temperature. So why is temperature important, or why do we measure temperature? So first of all, temperature is key for sterilization. So most of your pathogens and anything that can be harmful to and seeds also start dying off at above 60 degrees roughly. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So starts dying off at above 60 degrees Celsius. So we want to reach somewhere in the 55 to 70 degrees Celsius in terms for sterilization. Now, if you have got clean material that you're not afraid of having diseases or anything like that, then probably your high temperatures like 60 isn't necessary. So high temperatures required for sterilization, but theoretically your microbes are most active between 35 and 45 degrees Celsius. So if you want optimal decomposition and breakdown as quick as possible, you want to be running your pile at a temperature of 35 to 45 degrees Celsius. But that will mean that you might not sterilize it properly. So some of the seeds and the weeds and any other pathogens that might have been in your feedstock material might still translate and be carried into your orchard. So temperature is key because we want to be able to make sure that it's sterile and also safe. Also, temperature is used to tell us what phase of composting we are in. And we're going to look at that slide now in a few slides time, but temperature is also key. All right, so next up then, we'll just be talking about the practicality of building a compost pile and how do you approach it. So first of all, we need to start looking at what source materials you have. We've spoken about this in terms of the keys, but we need to know what we have available and in what form they are. Now, there's a nice picture of some nice chopped up macadamia branches. So we might have some pruning branches, we might have some grass or lucerne or something that's available close by. And at the end of the day, we want that material in the form that we are going to compost it. We want to start off with that and to make a calculation as to how to mix it. So you can think about it, having a pile of your branches chopped up. You might have a pile of your husks, and you might have a pile of let's say cattle manure or chicken manure. Now, those are our three ingredients that we might have available. So the easiest way to calculate and to actually determine how to mix these optimally, because there are ways to optimally mix a pile for decomposition and for it to be in a well-balanced, mature compost, is we want to know what the moisture content is, we want to know what the bulk density is, and we want to know what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is of each pile. So I'll show you now the calculations as to why that's important. But those are in essence the four aspects for us to do the theoretical approach on compost. Those are the four aspects we require. We need to know how much do we have. We need to know what our carbon to nitrogen ratio is. We need to know our bulk density and our moisture content. Moisture content is less relevant because you can always add water, but it is good to know just for interest's sake. So then we need to know that after the mixing, we will need to provide air and water. So do we have facilities? Do we have a system in place? Do we have a tractor or a digger loader or a turning machine or anything to be able to provide water and air to the pile? We need to think about what size of the pile we are going to be building. How big does it need to be effective, for it to actually decompose, for it not to be too hot or too cold, for it to be practical. So pile size consideration. And then lastly, what are we going to do with storage? And I'll touch on that also. So source material in terms of CN ratios. Now, this is some example information that I pulled off some literature papers that was done. And if you look at this graph, what you'll see on the left is various materials in terms of feedstocks. At the top, towards the right, you'll see there a basic analysis. You can go do a compost analysis from most of the labs. But the information that you need is the nitrogen percentage, the carbon percentage, the moisture content, and the bulk density. Now, what we then do with this is this gives us an idea as to how to balance compost. Now, if you have read the guideline that was set out, we typically want to aim to mix for around 35, it's carbon nitrogen ratio of 35:1, meaning for every 1 part of nitrogen, there's 35 parts of carbon. That's a good balance because that will then reduce to something like a 25 or a 20:1, or even lower. And the reason why is the carbon to nitrogen ratio is related to mineralization of nitrogen. So the lower our carbon to nitrogen ratio is, the more nitrogen will be available for the compost to release also to our crops. If we have a very high CN ratio in our compost, that means there's a high amount of carbon, meaning that compost will need to find nitrogen when we apply it for it to break down even further. So that's when we get the deficit in terms of nitrogen. So the basic thing to remember about CN ratios of compost is that the lower the CN ratio, the more plant nutrients and nitrogen will be available when we apply it. That's a rule of thumb. It's not always the case. There's other variables also, but that's the basic rule of thumb. The higher the CN ratio is, the more robust, the more carbon rich it is, meaning it will break down slower. It will have a different effect. It will not be as nutritious necessarily, but it will be more of a physical amendment, meaning soil structure, meaning giving some aeration and water holding capacity, etc. So depending on what you're trying to achieve with your compost, your CN ratio will be important. Now, just out of interest, you can see here grass clippings, for instance, has about, this is not very average, but 3.4% nitrogen. And the CN ratio will be, there you can see like 17, column number 2. Typically, now you can have everything analyzed on your form and then know exactly. If you look at your wood and paper-based materials, then you'll see something like wood chips. There's a good, okay, wood chips doesn't, hardwood, chip shavings, and so on. 0.09% nitrogen and 50% carbon, 60% carbon. So your wooden materials, your brown material, usually has got a very high CN ratio. So you can imagine then the higher CN ratio your feedstock, your wood material is, the more of nitrogen-rich material you would need to add to the pile to get the CN ratio in a good range. Does that make sense? So here's a calculation, and if you guys need help with it, I've got a whole Excel that I use to kind of calculate these things. But for instance, yeah, I pulled 2 of those type of ingredients together with their moisture and their carbon and their nitrogen content. And here I built a pile that, using the volume tab there, you can see that if I add 3 parts shrub trimmings to 6 parts grass clippings, I will then have a calculated CN ratio of about 33.6. My moisture, if it's still wet and in fresh form, will be exactly in the zone where I need to be. So what does it tell me? When I want to mix my compost pile, to start off with a good CN ratio, I'm going to put in roughly 30% shrub trimmings and 70% grass clippings. And one can go play around with the volumes and know then exactly how much. So this is the theoretical approach. Now, we can't always do that on a farm. We just have what we have, and we need to mix it together. But let's say if we want to go for the ideal mix of longevity in terms of decomposition, about structure, etc., then this would be the approach. If we've got availability of various feedstocks, then this would be the approach. So now we know, okay, I've got roughly in these mixing rates, I've got 9 cubes of material, but we can go change that. But the important part here is 30% to 70% will give me a relatively good starting CN ratio. And that means my compost will decompose very well. It will become mature. It will have longevity. Some other practical aspects, as we've said, is our pile size considerations and how do we build them. At the end of the day, our pile size will be determined by what we will be using to aerate or to mix. So if we look at these different methodologies, the pile size will vary. So if you're going to be using a bucket loader like a TLB, you can build a bigger pile, 3 to 6 meters, 1.8 to 2.4, because you are going to be scooping and mixing that whole thing as you can. If you've got a windrow, meaning the picture here on the left at the top, a small windrow tractor, you'll have to make a smaller pile because it needs to fit underneath the mixing implement. If you go for a bigger windrow tractor like the big John Deere standing here, then you can build a bigger pile because that will aerate it for you. And then at the end of the day, you've got also the other methodology is static aerated piles. Now, very few people do this because it takes a bit of infrastructure. But at the end of the day, this is a very good way to reduce your composting time. Why? Because you can put some irrigation on the top and you can aerate the piles from the bottom, meaning this compost will break down very quickly. So there's two different types here. You can just use a single static pile, or you can use an extended pile where you put various pipes, and that's what that would look like. So why, once again, is it important for the size of the pile? Because we want to control our composting timeline. So your pile size and your feedstock, so we know which feedstocks we have, we know what CN ratio we have, and now we know our size of our piles. This then will determine our timeline. So as you can see there, we've got a few phases in composting, and we measure it in terms of temperature. That's why temperature is important. So we've got our mesophilic phase, which is when the process is just starting, the microbes are becoming active, the temperature jumps. All of a sudden, you might have just made the pile, and then all of a sudden, the next day you get there and the temperature jumps into the 40 degrees. It climbs, it reaches the thermophilic phase, which is the phase where it's at its peak temperature, where it becomes sterile. Now, typically at this stage, this is when your maximum decomposition is happening. Now, what often happens is it drops off again because the CN ratio, either the oxygen becomes too little, so it's not aerated, or the water runs out, or even let me actually draw here. I'm going to quickly. So what we often see with a pile is, this is now theoretically, we see a jump, and then the pile does this. And then we add oxygen, water, or we just mix the materials, and then we see the jump again. Okay, so now because why? The microbes all of a sudden has access again to water and oxygen, so then they can break it down again. And then, so this is when we do turning actions usually. So then we see another turning action, it drops. Okay, we do another turning action, it jumps up. And then over time, what we'll see is we'll start seeing this. So as these steps go down, we know that our compost is maturing because the amount of raw carbon and raw organic matter is less available. So over time, we know that. So the process of knowing if our compost is mature is if we see this tendency that the temperature is not rising anymore, it's going down over time. And that means then it's stabilizing. So there's less material for the microbes to break down, meaning they become less active. And at the end of the day, we then know that our compost is stable. So if we spoke about it earlier, we said we've got our mixing and our aeration, and then the resting period is this stabilization phase. So this is where we just allow it to kind of simmer for the final microbes to work it through. Maybe some of our fungi and those type of biologicals start working and breaking it down completely. So the longer you leave this at the end of the day, the more broken down it will be, the more it will be in a nutrient available form, and it will be finer and more quick available to the macadamia roots, versus the quicker you take this out, the more chunks of carbon and raw chunks of wood and raw chunks of feedstock will be in it. The longer you allow for it to go, the finer it will be, the more reduced it will be at the end of the day, and more plant available it will be. So if we take that into consideration, then in terms of the method and timeline, if we go look at passive composting, which is just we make a pile. Now, let's be honest, that's what's happening on most farms, is We take our manure, we take our husks, and we just go make a pile, and then we leave it, and then 1 year later it happens. So it will still decompose at the end of the day, but it will be limited to a few number of microbes. Only certain microbes can work in anaerobic conditions, and we haven't created an optimal environment for the breakdown. So it takes a long time, and we might not have all the aromatic groups and all the, let's say, organic acids and everything that we could have created, humic and fulvic acids that could have been created, because we limited the types of microbes that can be active. Windrow, as we said, which is infrequent turning versus frequent turning. Here you can see you can increase the time or decrease the time and increase our usage rate of it a lot quicker by turning. Some, depending on what amendments is in it, if there's more nitrogen, as you can see, it will break down quicker. If there's less nitrogen, it will take longer. Here we just have leaves and manure. Here it's just manure pretty much, then it will break down quicker. And then you cure it for another few months. Then passively aerated windrows or static piles, here you can see you can even increase the times. So that's very important just to remember that, yeah, depending on what method we use, we can increase the volumes of compost that we can produce. But on most farms, we will probably be doing the passive composting or even the windrow infrequent turning. That's the reality. We don't always have material available, but that's the reality of what time it takes to break down. Maybe 6 months with another month or two to stabilize. Okay, so if we then have to just look at the quality and the application, is before we want to apply it, we want to know what we're working with. So the method of application will be determined by the quality or the final product. It's no use I'm trying to do something with a compost that wasn't built for its application method, then I just won't get the result. So it's important to think, first of all, what's my quality and what's my variables of my compost. Then I want to make sure that I apply it in the correct time. It's no use I go apply it in the middle of the winter, in the driest part where there's months of no rainfall, no nothing, and it just gets burned by the sun. Or we apply it in at a time where we don't want maybe a deficit or a negative impact of the nitrogen. So it's just important to think about what your compost, after you know the quality, what you want it to do. Do you want it just to lie on the surface? Do you want it to actually have an effect on your rooting system? So depending on what your quality is and the purpose, you can determine your application timing. But at the end of the day, you want it to stimulate root growth. You want to help it to increase water holding capacity, etc. So I always recommend it when the raining season comes, when the rainfall starts. It's a good time. And then, of course, it's important to go look at your orchard's limitations as to when and where to apply it. So if you already have soil limiting factors, it might be worthwhile to apply your compost in the blocks that already have soil issues, that is struggling with compaction, that is struggling with crust formation, that might be very sandy with low water holding capacity. Those would be your primary blocks where you start. Even in terms of soil chemistry, if there's already issues in some of those soils and your compost, maybe the feedstock you had available, let's say you already have high phosphorus in your soils, and now you used a lot of chicken manure in your compost, you're just going to be piling on phosphorus in that case. So it's important to look at your soil analysis and to then look at your compost analysis and make a well-discerned decision as to, is this the best product for this type of soil at the end of the day? Now, what are the norms? The norms are very broad, I'll be honest with you. This is from the United European Soil Society or Compost for Organic Material. I can't remember exactly the place, but it's a very vague guideline. If you read the literature in the world, because compost varies so much according to the material being used and the method of being compost, there's very little strict guidelines as to this is a good compost, because there's so much variables and so many applications and uses of it that there's not necessarily a good compost or a bad compost. There's just a rule for what is a safe compost or a mature compost. So this is what these guidelines are. This is just if anything is over or outside of this, it just means maybe there was something out of balance in terms of the composting process. Okay, so if we see there, EU wants it to be less than, oh, that's wrong with the side around, wants the more than 20%, because the CN ratio needs to be 20. Yeah. So your carbon, a good compost will be more than 20% carbon. And your non-organic material must be less than 1 according to them. So that just means you don't necessarily want to buy a compost with a bunch of soil and other things that someone just worked in to build up the volume, unless that's what you want. That's fine, but in terms of purchasing a compost, you don't want non-organic material to be more than 1%. Your pH should be somewhere between 6.5 and 8.5. Usually, the longer the compost matures, the closer it will get to around 7. If there maybe was a lot of volatiles or very little ammonium or anything like that in it, then your pH might be slightly lower, but it should be somewhere between 7 7.5 if it's mature, in my experience. EC, you just don't want something very high in salts, because that's just adding salts to your soil and to your orchard. Resistance, you want it to be higher than 150, and not everybody doesn't necessarily work with resistance, but it's another measurement of salt content. CN ratio. So I read the literature again, and it is categorized as a very mature compost, meaning a lot of decomposition and has stabilized for a long time, will probably finish at around a 10 to 12 to 1. That's like your most mature compost that you're probably going to get. So anything below 20 to 1 is very good. That means there's a good balance of nitrogen in relation to carbon, which means the mineralization of nitrogen will be, there will be bigger chances for nitrogen mineralization, meaning nitrogen taken from organic form to inorganic form that's plant available much easier. There's a bunch of variances with regards to heavy metals. I usually just run a quick check on heavy metals when looking at a compost analysis, just to check that we're not adding anything dangerous to our soils, especially if we're working in food production. And then there's some ammonium to nitrate levels. Why is that important? So your ammoniums peak during the thermophilic phase, if that makes sense. So if we during the decomposition phase, that's when your ammonium becomes the highest. All right, so your ammonium levels becomes the highest, and then over time, those ammonium starts converting into nitrates. So if you get a pile that has an analysis and the ammoniums are very high and the nitrates are very low, that means that this compost pile was probably not in the maturation phase. It was just mixed for a short period. It went through the thermophilic phase, but then whoever is selling this or giving you this compost went and said, no, this thing is ready, it looks nice, we're sending it out. But it never actually went into the maturing and resting phase, so we don't have an accumulation of nitrates. The issue here is that you can balance. Of course, when nitrates become more, it becomes higher risk of the nitrates actually leaching. So this is the important thing, is you don't necessarily want to be, as soon as it starts going into the maturation phase and you think it's stable, the best thing to do in terms of storage is then to spread out your compost and have it dry, so that all the microbes go into hibernation or resting. There's no more activity, so then all the nutrients will also be fixed. You don't want it to be sitting in the rain for months and years, because then all your nitrates will be leaching out over time. All the fulvic and humic acids will be leaching out. So the best thing to do with regards to storage is, as soon as that pile is mature, dry it out and stockpile it somewhere where it's dry and out of the environment, so that it can actually retain all its nutrients, and out of the sun, so it doesn't break down. So yeah, those are the basic norms. But please hear me when I say this. If something doesn't necessarily fit into this, it doesn't mean it's a bad compost. It just means the way I'm going to use it is going to be different. I'm going to run you through an example. Actually, on the next slide. And then I'm pretty much done, and we can have some questions. So first of all, when we measure, we determine the quality. What do I want to know? I want to know what's my CN ratio, and I want to know, I don't necessarily need to know all these things, but I just want to know what my pH is, want to know what my carbon content is. I want to know if it's a fine compost or is it like a rough compost. Is it big parts or small parts? Is it still chunky, or is it, because that will determine what its best use will be. So I evaluate that then and decided, so I'll give you an example. If I receive a compost that's maybe a 60:1 CN ratio, that's still got nice big pieces of bark in it, that's robust, it hasn't been put through a sieve or anything, I will not use that compost or take it into consideration as a nutritional amendment to my soil. Because I know the CN ratio is too far apart, meaning that compost will most likely immobilize nitrogen in the soil, because the microbes will start eating whatever nitrogen is in the soil to start breaking down the material. So in that case, I will use it on top of the soil surface, most likely, maybe work it into the first 5 centimeters if possible, but it will be more of a mulch/compost in that regard. And it will help with water retention. It will help build my soil structure. It will help with the water retention in terms of water runoff. So for that type of compost, I will see it as a long-term soil amendment that will over time break down and increase my nutrient availability. But in the short term, it will not be a fertilizer amendment, if that makes sense. If I've got a very fine, rich compost with a low CN ratio, that will tell me, okay, this thing went through a long maturation process that will have a lot of carboxylic acids and a lot of fulvic and humic acids. It will be reactive. It will probably have a high nitrate and ammonium content to a certain extent. It will be an active compost, meaning it will immediately release nutrients into my soil. That means, okay, it might be good to put it inside the soil, because if I put that outside on the surface, the wind and the sun and the rain is just going to wash it away. So I want to protect it. I want to incorporate it into the soil as to come inside and alongside my fertilizer program, if that makes sense. So that will also then, you can either put compost into the soil. So when planting, my rule of thumb when applying compost in soil and mixing it into soil is no more than 1/3 compost to 2/3 soil. The reason is just for if there's anything in terms of chemistry that we don't want to completely, we want the soil to be able to buffer any reactions that might still take place in that time. So it's just safe to do 1/3 to 2/3. It's not the golden rule, but that's my methodology. If I apply on the surface and it's a very fine compost, I will apply it on the surface, but then I would like to cover it with a mulch, because the fine compost, the wind will blow away. It will be more volatile. The nutrients might get wet, and we can get some urea, we can get some ammonium, or we can get some volatilization at the end of the day. So I want to protect a fine compost with a mulch, and I want to use a robust compost with a high CN ratio, more like a mulch, if that makes sense. So those are mostly our 2 ways of applying it. It's either on top of the surface or in the soil, covered or non-covered. Best practice for any compost is applying it, but then covering it if it's on top of the surface. And yeah, that's the basics of it. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Okkert. That was very insightful. Any questions for Okkert?
Okay, my name's Quentin Elliott. I just wanted to find out with macadamia specifically, which is more beneficial, with obviously our farming practices, putting manures and that on the soil is frowned upon when coming to harvest and all that. So we've been told to plant like as close to post-harvest as possible. And what sort of ratio of sort of bigger chunks of woody material to, say, macadamia husk, which will obviously form the bulk of our compost, would you put together, please?
Yeah, Quentin, it's a good question. I'll be honest with you. I do not have a fixed rule. That will be depending on the scenario. I would rather look at what my compost looks like. So if I make my compost on my own farm, and I've left it too long, it broke down, and it has become a very fine material, then I would treat it differently, as I said, versus a woody material. Sometimes we don't always have the time, but I like a good balance. So if it's a very fine compost with not a lot of woody material, then I would like to protect it with a mulch. For me, for practicality reasons, I just like a good balance of 50-50, because then you get the best of both. You get some longevity in terms of your compost, because the finer it is, the quicker it will be broken down and incorporated into the soil, but also the less the let's say soil moisture retention benefit you get. So we always want to have something that protects the soil from the sun, which is the more woody material will kind of do that and protect your soil moisture. But you also want something fine that can actually start pulling those humic and fulvic acids and organic material into the root zone to increase your biologicals and your microbial. So if you can get a balance between the two, that's ideal. But if you have one that's either or, then you just need to compensate for the weakness of the one by adding something of the other, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Sipiwe. You're muted.
Is there any special mechanism to measure this thing, temperature, and also the ratio of nitrogen, carbon nitrogen?
Yes, so the lower your CN ratio is, of course, the higher your temperature potentially can be. So if you are at around 25 to 20 to 30, you will get the temperatures you need. The best way so what I would usually recommend is you mix your pile, and then you go every day or every second day, and you get these long 60 centimeter temperature probes that you can buy online, and you go measure your temperature every second day. And then if you see your pile is reaching 60 degrees Celsius, I would then go and say, okay, well, I can go mix it again. So it reached 60 for a day or two, I can go mix it, and that will then, or I see it goes 60 and it starts going to 50, it starts dropping, then I'll go mix it. The mechanism is just, you want, if there's too little carbon at the end of the day in relation to nitrogen, your temperature will not go very high, because there's not enough food to sustain a lot of microbes anymore. The amount of carbon is too little. So that's why over time the carbon becomes too little. That's why the temperature doesn't rise anymore. So the microbes that can still function just becomes less. So it's at the start you want high carbons, and then you want it to build down, but you need to make sure the nitrogen is enough, and you just use your temperature to see if that process is continuing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
We've got time for one last question. Thomas?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me, but thanks, Rocket. That was an excellent thing to listen to. Is there a chance we can get a copy of this? Is there a link we can get a copy of this and have a look at it? I've been taking notes, but obviously not fast enough. So if I can get a copy, that would be excellent.
We have recorded it and we will make it available.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think sorry, Lisa, I'll
okay.
just wrap up then if there's no other questions from my side. I think the reality is there's a lot of margin in this. As long as we remember what the purpose is of compost and we understand what we're trying to achieve, then there's a lot of grace in terms of how we use it. And that's the beauty of this is we can go depending on our purpose and what our limitations are of our orchards. Is it it's nutritional problem? Is it a structure problem? Is it an aeration problem? Is it a diversity problem? We can use compost and build compost in various ways to address the problem. And that's the goal here. So there's not necessarily a wrong way. There's just a method behind the madness when applying it. And as long as we understand that concept.
A big thank you to Okkert for your time and for your effort. We really appreciate it. And to our listeners, in the chat, there's a link to the PDF of our best practice as well. And thank you.